You're live. Wow. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. If I'm really live, then I presume you can hear me and that I have actual audio. Let me look for a meter to see if I have any audio. Yeah, I seem to. So things might look a little different, especially in the background. You're used to me being on the other side and the camera being pointed at me. And what's going on now is I've had all the cabinetry and everything else blown out of the shop. And this is normally where I film on that side. And so now I'm on the workbench on the other side while I have that side rebuilt. I spent most of yesterday pulling absolutely everything out and unwiring everything, including all the PC, the Mac, the Synology NAS, the 10G wiring for the LAN. What else did I have to pull? I had to pull out absolutely everything, plus all the shop stuff in order to get it out of there because it's the main workbench. Oh, and all the cabinets were full of electronics and goo and wires and cables and everything else. So that's what I spent today doing. And then today was demolition day, where they came in and ripped out all the cabinets. By they, I mean Luis, who's like the power of 10 men, but it was just one guy. So we got everything ripped out today and hauled away. So now I have kind of a blank canvas. As you can see, and you can't see the whole wall, but it's about twice of what you can see there. And one of the problems with my old setup was that I was, as you can't see, but like I am now, I was rammed up against the workbench with cabinets on the front face. So I'm working in front of me, which is terribly ergonomically because you have to lean over everything. So my wife finally said, no, you have to get something done and build something where you can put your knees under your desk, at least if you're going to sit out here all the time. So I had moved from my home office out to the shop when I started working on electronics because I don't want to burn down the house. If I burn down my detached shop, which is a separate building, I mean, I don't want that to happen, but better that than the family home. So on things that I am building myself or I'm not an engineer, I prefer to not have them running in my house. What else is going on? That is the main thing in terms, and I should be back up doing actual pre-recorded videos in another week or so, but I thought I would do a live stream on a Saturday night just for the hell of it, just to see what's going on. I know it's a bad time for European folks, especially, and I apologize for that, but it is something I wanted to do on a Saturday night, and you can't move Saturday night. It is when it is. And it's GMT -8 for me. So normal live streams I do try to do in the early mornings, which works well for the European crowd. Less so for the Australian guys, but it still works. So that's kind of the best case for everybody. Normally, that is what I try to do. What else have I got? Now, the big thing we're working on the channel is prime sieve racing, which you've seen in the C versus C++ versus Python episode. And what we've done is, well, I shouldn't say we, what happened is it blew up. I checked in the code into GitHub, and I checked in those three implementations, the C, the C#, and the Python. And all of a sudden, people started adding other implementations. And pretty soon, we had an impressive list of languages and very fast implementations of the C Civ in languages that I have to admit that I'd never even heard of before. So we had all the main contenders, C and C#, Rust, assembly language, even Pascal. Well, actually, I've got a list. Let me look at the list here. So here's what we've got. We've got ARM and x86 assembly. We've got now Ada and BASIC and C and C++ and C#. Then we have Crystal, D, and Dart. We have Delphi, F#, and Fortran. We have Go, Hax, or Haskell. I'm not sure which, because it might be a typo. Java, Julia, Lisp, Mixel, Nim, OCaml. I have no idea what OCaml actually is, but it looks kind of cool. It's certainly different. PHP, Pascal, Perl, Python, Ruby, Rust, Scala, Swift, TypeScript, V, and Zig. So from Ada to Zig, basically. So people have, and not me, I had nothing to do with this. They took my code and they ported it, the same algorithm, to 30 languages so that we could find out what the difference is in the languages. But what's even cooler about it is that if you look at all the implementations, you can see what's the difference. Let's compare, say, Pascal to C. Well, just the control structures, sorry. How do you do a while? How do you do a loop? How do you do an if then else? How do you do system output? How do you print a new line? Well, those are kind of the top 5 things you need to know when you're picking up a language of any kind, and they're all within the main loop of a sieve, so it's handy. What else? So basically, I checked it into GitHub, and it launched on itself, and I realized there were all these people partying, and I had no idea what to do because I barely understand GitHub. When I left, we were using Source Depot. We hadn't moved to Git yet, so I used Git for my own projects. but I've never done any big collaboration with GitHub. And so what I did is I posted and I was like, if anybody really understands GitHub well and wants to play, let me know. You can have this whole project, just please take it from me. And a fellow named Rolf over in the Netherlands did so. And so I gave him the keys and let him run with it. And pretty soon he had two more of his countrymen on board, Tudor and Rutger. And they have really knocked it out of the park between the three of them. They have not only contributed implementations in assembly and a couple other languages, but they have added build scripts so that you basically go into the folder, type make, and it will build it for 30 different languages in 50 different implementations. And then benchmark all the languages and produce a spreadsheet at the end, which is all the languages compared in terms of passes per second that they can do of the sieve and so on. And it's really quite impressive. And so I'm going to get a free episode out of it from my perspective because somebody else has done all the homework. But I guess from their perspective, we'll surface all this work and it will get kind of summarized and a video made about it. So it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody. At least I like to think of it that way. And I've had such a good experience with GitHub now and the open source movement that I had a previously commercial project that I was going to release something commercial with it because I didn't want to just give the code away to be exploited by the Eastern markets. So I was going to try and make something of it, but I'm just going to put it on GitHub and make a couple of videos about it and let people run with it. And if you look at my channel, there's an old video called The Mesmerizer, and that's probably the best demo of it. That and the fireworks on my pool house. What that is using is it's using the LED project that I'm speaking of. And let me back, I want to figure out how far I need to back up in order for this to make sense. It is a microcontroller and a PC project. What happens is the PC draws effects on a canvas, and then you have LED strips and LED matrices scattered around. So let's say you have your eave troughs on your house, and you have 5 segments on one eaves, and then you have 3 on the garage. So you have 8 segments broken up into 2 locations, and the software can draw across them as if it's one long strip, and then it will coordinate between the microcontrollers that own each strip, and it will send it to them over Wi-Fi. Everything is time-stamped, generated about a second to a second and a half in the future. Every microcontroller has a buffer of about 40 frames, and so it can vary as the Wi-Fi stack kind of drifts in and out. And they keep a view of what they're supposed to be drawing on the canvas, and they're all synchronized by SMTP to the atomic clock. That's why it works. So as I was trying to think, well, how does this work? Oh yeah, that's why it works. So a firework can branch across 2 LED strips that are owned by 2 LED strips on 2 different microcontrollers that are totally not interconnected, except they're both known to the Wi-Fi, and it works. You can have a Jumbotron, and all the blocks can be on Wi-Fi, and none of them are wired together, and it still works. So it's kind of interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to make some videos on how do you take it and how do you do a little show for your room or your house, or make a small display unit. Like you've probably seen on Facebook, somebody's put on one of the venture capital sites and they've raised $1 million for it. I'm like, I have some code that does that. So I'm going to just release it and see how it goes. Let me check my laptop really quick. Looks like I'm still getting questions. So I'm guessing everything is still working, or Glenn would let me know. Where are we at? So the server draws scenes on the canvases. The color data is compressed. Oh yeah, so all the color data is generated on the server. And let's say it's drawing fireworks or a rainbow or something really simple. Then it breaks it up. It sends packets to each of the Wi-Fi hosts, and it does it by compressing with LZ Compress, which is not, obviously the best compression in the world, but these are microcontrollers. They can only do so much, and they're getting 30 to 40 frames a second of color data and decompressing it live on the fly. So it's actually pretty impressive they can do it at all. But hey, they seem to be happy with it. They work. So what else? They're all synced to SMTP, as I said, and the drawing can span multiple strips. We might as well move on to Windows projects and Windows questions. And one thing I can't answer, I get this just a ton of it, and I wish I could, but I can't. But why hasn't Microsoft fixed the bug that bothers you the most? It's been years. It's been in the product. I understand that. I know they should fix it. They're not fixing it just to piss you off. I get that. I honestly don't know why. So when it's like, why, when I pay a document from Word, if I've added the printer through Active Directory with PowerShell, I get an extra page, but not with the UI. I don't know. I wish I knew, but I don't know. So if it's something I worked on, I got a shot. If it's something from my era, I've got a shot. But if it's like, why does something in Windows 10 work some way that it does? I don't know. So let's see what we've got for questions that are not like that. Let's see. Were there any projects that you wished you had been a part of? Yes, Xbox is something that I probably should have stuck around and gone over to and worked on. Because first of all, Dave C went there, and I always wanted to work with Dave C. I did on NT, but I would have followed him around if I could have. The second is that it just seemed very cool and much lighter weight than a full PC project. So Windows on a PC has lots of things. It has accessibility. It has multiple languages installed at the same time. All kinds of stuff can be crazy on a PC compared to an Xbox. It's a pretty well understood, smaller problem space. It all runs not in the same ring, but you don't have all the kernel user transitions that you normally have on a PC. So you get some advantage that way. Basically, it's like a smaller microcosm of a PC that's easier to understand and wrap your head around. I think it just would have been fun to work on. So I'm not a graphics guru. I did a bunch of 3D work in DirectX 10 and 11 about the era that DirectX 11 was new, if that kind of dates me. The standard, I've made a globe of skull on fire with chrome and crystal and spinning it on a marble pillar. Yes, that's what I did. So I think it's kind of the thing everybody does, but it looked cool. What's next here? Do you know why? Oh, here we go. Do you know why? No, I don't know why. Why MS designed the executable with resources built in rather than separate, rather than most OSs? Well, a lot of OSs, like Apple, actually put the resources in a separate fork on the file. NTFS has separate forks for files. In fact, you can do it that way. Nobody does. Your linker could actually put all your resources on a separate fork, and the Windows loader would be able to handle it. I've never seen a binary generated that way. The only thing I've used, and I thought this was a pretty clever use of alternate streams on files, was I did a clipboard history program years ago. And then recently, as in like 5 years ago, I was working on a modern version of it. And what I did was I made it so that it stored everything just as a JPEG, but then all my data was in alternate streams. And if it was lost, it could always be reconstructed because it was basically cached information about the JPEG. So things could be in the native format, and all my data was in alternate streams that could be lost if it was copied around and moved to a place that didn't have alternate streams. But as long as it did, all this metadata would follow the file around that I could copy and paste and manage and drag and drop this object in a way that I couldn't otherwise, and nobody else would know. They would just see it as a JPEG. So why didn't they? Probably because Windows 3.1 didn't have alternate streams. The Mac did at some point, probably in that era. I don't know if the original Macintosh had resource forks on files, but let's say it did. That would be Windows 2 point something days, and they already had Windows 1 out before that, and it was a really simple file system, FAT32. Or no, I guess it was FAT16 or FAT12 in those days. Probably, let's say FAT12. So why? Because it ran on FAT12. And so because it evolved from that, they didn't have resource forks until they had them, and they couldn't be dependent on them. So they added support for them, but not a dependency on them. How's that? The internet tray icon repair feature in Windows seemed to fix most of my internet problems. This was replaced by Troubleshooter later, which rarely works. Any insight you can give? Not a lot, because again, that's a fair bit after my time, but one feature that I have made a ton of use of myself in the last 3 days is the network reset feature. If you've never used it, it's wonderful. It's like I'm going to reboot and format my PC, but just the networking. It goes through, it resets everything, it deletes any bridges you had, it resets any adapters, any Wi-Fi's. It does what you think it does. It completely resets the network state and goes back to default and then rediscovers your devices from there. Super handy because, well, you don't need to know my bugs, but I created a bridge and then I put one of my VM switches in the bridge and couldn't get it back out. This was a bug in Windows, I think, in one of the insider builds. I kept just resetting the network stack, rebooting, and fixed the problem every time. So very handy. What did Dave build in the shell? Well, I did a task manager was the first thing I probably did in the shell. Well, the first thing I did for shell was to port it from Win95 to Windows NT. So we spent about the better part of a year, I would say, taking all the code that was intended for Windows 95, and this was in 1994, 95, before it had shipped, and then made that code ready for NT. And there are a number of changes I think I've talked about before that, you need to make any Windows 95 program to get it to be really a good Windows NT candidate, which is multilingual Unicode support, support for file systems, just a bunch of stuff that wasn't in Win95 that we had to add support for. and a certain number of robustness features because we had the memory that we could dedicate to doing things that they had to kind of run leaner and meaner. So we had a slightly different programming, I don't want to say approach, but we could afford to check for null where they didn't have the extra space to do so sometimes. And it doesn't mean that they were like riskier. It just means that they would be more deterministic when they crashed, whereas we would probably survive till the next time you did something stupid and called the API wrong. So looking back, I'm not sure there's a huge amount of difference in terms of robustness, but we did in terms of adding things like getting rid of shared memory and things that were shared between shell processes. So a lot of things like that, because there was a bunch of shared features that we made into named pipes and broke out, did separately. So what did I do? I ported it for like a year. Then I got to work on some features. I owned Calc for a while. I did Windows Pinball. That was something we ported, and I didn't write the game. I didn't do the graphics. I didn't do the game design. Didn't do anything. That game already existed. But I took it and I made it work on Windows NT. And the harder part of that was making it work on MIPS and Alpha and PowerPC, because those were all CPUs, excuse me, that we supported at the time. And a lot of the game, not a lot of the game, but a good chunk of the game, including all the sound engine and everything related to it, was written in x86 assembly. So I couldn't just directly port it. It's pretty hard to do a instruction for instruction port of something that's kind of hard to understand anyway, because I'm not a sound engine guy. What I wound up doing was rewriting it in C, because I could do that, and then it would compile for all the platforms, which is what I did. So basically, I took the game and I rewrote a bunch of it in C, and then to make it work with the graphics that we were using on NT, I wrote another layer on top of the game. So the game thought it was drawing to its original stuff, but it was being hijacked by me and then drawing to my surfaces through, I don't know if it was WinG or it was some ancient graphics technology that was before DirectX. So whatever was on NT before DirectX, it could be as simple as just to create div section, and being able to copy around div sections was a big part of it. And that's all the graphic elements are drawn in the game that way. Why did you become a Microsoft developer, and was it fun? I became a Microsoft developer because I had no idea what I was going to do by the third year of college. I mean, I knew as a programmer, I loved to program, but was I going to go work for the wheat pool and write code that weighed the trucks that came in with the grain that were going to the elevator? And I had no idea what I was going to do. Was I going to work on microwave ovens in Toronto? I don't know. So I was working for the phone company, and I was sitting in the food court eating my lunch, and I had to buy a book to pass the time. So the book I bought was Hard Drive, the story of Bill Gates and the making of Microsoft. I read that book on my lunchtime, and then I started reading it at home. And basically, I read it in a couple of days because I just devoured the book. I was just fascinated with the stories of the people that worked there and the projects they were working on. This was all MS-DOS time, MS-DOS era projects that they were working on, and some Windows 1.0 and 2.0 stuff as well. So I decided that this is where I wanted to work, because these guys sound like me, they act like me, they are what I want to be when I grow up. And holy cow, they pay them well, apparently. So I wrote to everybody that I could find that had a Microsoft email address, which was about 4 people, because I had a software product people had been registering on the Amiga. And one guy, Alistair Banks, and I realized I told this story before, but not everybody's heard it. So, hey, somebody asked a question, I'll answer it. Alistair responded, and he hooked me up with a hiring manager directly within Windows that had an open slot that was hiring, and I believe it was Anthony Short. And a couple interview slots later, I went up as an intern in MS-DOS working for Ben Slivka. So you would think, oh, an intern on MS-DOS, what'd you do? Like format disks? No, it's amazing to me, actually. They give you as much work as they believe that you are capable of, and they get you for all that you're worth, basically. They had me write a bunch of major features, like the smart drive cache for CD-ROMs was the first thing I wrote. Then I wrote disk copy, making it work single pass. Bunch of features in MS-DOS. I rewrote setup to work on a single floppy disk by using deltas and patching in place DOS 5 to turn it into DOS 6, something like that. Or maybe it was DOS 6 and a 6.2. Well, actually, it could do anything if you gave it the deltas. A whole bunch of features within the span of like 3 months, which to me was fairly impressive at the time, I thought. And that only got me an interview. I thought, I knocked it out of the park. I'm a shoo-in. They're going to hire me. No problem. Nope, doesn't work that way. That just means I got an interview, and that's really all I know. Fortunately, when I came back from my interview, I passed, even though I probably kind of assumed that I was, I don't think I was going to get in for free based on my intern performance, but I thought it gave me a leg up. But the questioning and the people that I saw on my full-time interview loop were pretty demanding. So it was a good loop. Let's see. Why did you retire, and what do you miss most about being a Microsoft developer? Well, in backwards order, the thing I miss most, and you'll hear this from professional athletes, you'll hear it from pretty much everybody that's worked in any industry and then moved on. I miss going for lunch with the people that I went for lunch with and talking to the people that I worked with, because they were a lot like me. They had similar interests. They had similar abilities. They were people like me. We went for lunch. We ate food. It was awesome. And then we talked about cool things, and we did that every day. And now I don't get to do that, or I get to do it, rarely, because I take guys out for lunch and stuff, but it's not the same. So that's really what I miss. And I miss somebody always feeding me something interesting to do, because now I have to go out and find something interesting to do on my own. And I can't make everything be monetarily remunerative. So what am I going to do? Work on things that are interesting. Well, if I said, go work on things that are interesting, how long could you do that for? Well, it turns out a couple of years at least, for sure. But I've been doing that like 15 years now. So I've gone through a lot of things. It's like after I do AI next, I don't know what's left. But I don't mean that I'm doing professional levels at any of these things. I'm doing the dilettante, autodidact, learning the interesting parts of graphics so that I know enough at graphics cocktail parties to sound intelligent, but I couldn't go and work for id or write Quake, or I could write Quake now because Quake's already been written. But what historical Microsoft software from the 80s and 90s would you like to see open source the same way as Microsoft open source MS-DOS 1.2.5 and 2.0? Is there anything you may think may be interesting? Well, I would like to see pretty much all of 16-bit Windows and all of MS-DOS and some select application code from that era open sourced. I don't think there's any reason to hold back any of MS-DOS at this point. And they have absolutely no reason to open source any of it, really, other than PR, because all it brings them is potential liability, complaints, and angst, and probably nothing positive for putting the code out there and exposing it to ridicule, because it's ancient code at this point. It's like, oh, look at what Microsoft did. Well, yeah, I know Linux is cool now, but go look at Linux code from 1991, and I worked on some of that code. Well, 93 I did. It's not the same as what you see today. So yeah, MS-DOS probably looks archaic, although it's super tight. It doesn't have many bugs. It's just written differently than you would write code today, because you're targeting something that is a very different CPU and memory system and PC as a whole. And it's so much more limited that everybody's sacred, every cycle matters, that kind of thing that you don't worry about now. But I'd still like to see all the code from back then that's not embarrassing released. What editor IDE you use primarily when working back at Microsoft? When I first started, I came in, I had been working on the Amiga using Cygnus editor by a guy named Bruce Dawson. Why I know the name of the guy that wrote my editor in the 90s, I have no idea. No, I do know, but it's weird that I remember. Then I moved to Microsoft, and I thought, oh, I'm never going to adapt to another. You know how you get like passionate about your editor, and it's like, I live here. I'm not going to just move to some other editor if there's like bare walls and there's nothing going on. You get kind of attached, and so I was recalcitrant to move on. I thought, oh, maybe I'll just set up an Amiga and I'll edit source code on that or something, which would be a terrible idea. So I learned Visual Slick. That was it. Same color scheme, same everything. So Slick Edit was the DOS precursor of it, and then I used Visual Slick, which was the Windows NT version of it. And I think we had a site license for it or something on the NT team, if I remember, because I had a licensed copy, but I don't remember buying it and taking it to work. But I know it was licensed, so I think we had a license. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. What else did I use? Then I moved on to Visual, I guess it would be Visual C. It was not Visual Studio at that point. It was like Visual C 1.0 and then Visual C incremental versions, then 2.0. And it had the integrated editor and debugger. and you could replace the font. And I had an awesome font called MS Mail 3, which was the font from MS Mail for the monospaced email messages way before Outlook, like 1993-ish. And I liked that font. So that font followed me around for years, and I would use it in Visual Studio, and it was very compact and would give me like 120 columns on a cheap monitor, that kind of thing. So I used Visual Studio for years, and I just grew with Visual Studio. And I always did Visual Studio until recently when I started doing microcontroller work. And I even started that with Visual Studio using Visual Micro. But I pretty quickly moved to the Platform IO IDE using Visual Studio Code. And although I do actually in many ways prefer, you know what, it's weird. I like them both for different reasons. I like Visual Studio because it has a tool or a wizard to do what it is that you want to do. But I like Visual Studio Code because it has none of that, but it's so bare that you can understand how to do most of that yourself. Although it's a completely different paradigm. So they're both good tools and they're both good editors, but they're very different. Let's see. Was Commander Shell ever intended for more than VBS or simple script? Scripting and, let's put Bash in Windows, man. That would be awesome. Well, I don't know why they didn't put it in, but you can't make it as a default because so many things are so dependent on the fact that the set command worked like it did in 1981. And for loop must work exactly why. If you're really bored, go to an NT command or Windows command prompt and type set space / question mark and look at the help for the set command. And if that doesn't impress you, look at the help for the for command. Those two alone should blow you away with the amount of work that people, and I don't know if it's Mark Z or who's really done that work over the years, but I forget who owned command prompt. I should find out because there's an incredible amount of work in there to be backwards compatible. You can't just, I'm going to add a keyword. Well, what if somebody had a batch file named that keyword already? You just broke everybody at, the wheat pool or whatever theoretical organization I'm thinking of. So there are so many restrictions to what you can change about CMD that they eventually decided, well, we're going to do PowerShell. And PowerShell is pretty good. It's very verbose, but it can do pretty much anything. So that's nice. But I'm kind of a bash man myself. So that's what I use all the time. And I actually wind up in myself in WSL2 running a version 2 Ubuntu command shell and then using a mount point back to my own files so that I'm operating on my files, but with the Linux command prompt, which is kind of the best of both worlds, I think. There are certain things I go back to PowerShell for if I have to, turn on Windows features, that kind of thing. I don't know how to do that in Bash. If it's possible, I have no idea. So I do that in PowerShell, but everything else like file manipulation and scripting, Docker stuff, I do that all in Bash. Have you ever played Roblox? No, but my kids are big Minecraft fans. They're a little old for Roblox, but I was always, I guess it sounds bad. I was so impressed with Minecraft that Microsoft bought it. But I don't know if they paid a fair price for it because they paid a lot of money for it. But Minecraft as a concept is pretty amazing. Have you ever used Commodore 64 or Amiga? Yes, that's what I grew up on. Commodore 64 is actually pretty much what I started on. The very first thing I ever programmed on was a TRS-80 in the store, but the first computer that I ever owned was a Commodore 64 that my parents bought for me with a floppy drive from Computer House, which was an unauthorized Commodore reseller of gray market material, but they were significantly cheaper than Eaton's or Sears or Target or whatever you have in those days. So being rather budget constrained at that time, that's where we got our Commodore 64. Then I later got a job writing Commodore 64 games, and I kind of parlayed that into enough money to buy a Commodore 128, and eventually a Commodore Amiga 500, and eventually a 2500 with a 68030 board. And then that's about the time I got the job at Microsoft in the early 90s. Was Windows 95 rushed out too soon to counter warp? Well, it's hard for me to say. I certainly didn't see any internal pressure that anybody cared about warp. I mean, we had warp. I looked at warp. I had a box. I installed it on a machine and went, cool icons. But we looked at all the features and said, it doesn't change our ship date, I guess. So no, I don't think there was any rush to get it out any sooner than you could get Windows 95 out. And there was huge pressure to get it out on time and at a quality level, because first of all, imagine the poor guy. I think is it Brad Chase or Brad Silverberg? I forget actually who it is. So whoever signed the actual release for I'm going to ship Windows 95, huge stones on that man, because it could have been a girl, but it wasn't. It was Brad. So there were warehouses stocked. They actually had to stop pressing Michael Jackson CDs for a while to get the capacity to make enough Windows 95 CDs to stockpile them in warehouses. And so the guy is like making decisions about, is this bug serious enough to, and he's got warehouses full of these coasters potentially. So he's got tens of millions of copies of Windows in warehouses queued up to be released on a particular date. And if there's a bug serious enough, he's going to have to scrap them all, start again. So he's got that call to make every morning, or probably more than once a day, probably, as you get close to ship. And so in terms of rushing, I think there was great hesitancy to push it out too fast, because nobody wanted to be in a position where they were responsible for the problem that made us look stupid. And that's true of a developer, that's true of a tester, that's true of an executive, and that's true of everybody in the line there, because you were all accountable for what we were producing as a product, and nobody wanted to look like an idiot. And I think everybody felt personally invested and bought in to the operating systems in those days, and I assume it's still true, such that you would not ship nonsense. And it's not to say the company has never shipped nonsense, but I've never been part of a project where it was like, just ship it. I don't care what's going on. Certainly never at Microsoft. It's probably happened, but I've never been part of anything like that. What do you think about Windows NT text mode, the auto check thing? Text mode, the only thing I really know about text mode is that I'm told that the MIPS was painfully slow at scrolling text. And so Dave C. took it on as a personal mission to make it faster and rewrote the MIPS text handling entirely in 68,000 assembly language and made it blazingly fast and checked it in. And for a long time, until I don't know if they fixed the issue in the MIPS firmware or if they changed the way text mode was drawn on a MIPS or what they did, but they changed something where it was no longer required. But for a long time, that was one of the big chunks of assembly language that was still in Windows. That's a question I get a lot, which is, what language is Windows written in? Actually, there's two questions. What language? And the answer is pretty much C and C++. There's a mix of both. I'm not aware of any other language. And as soon as I'm done making this video, I'll be like, oh yeah, don't forget there's VBA use. Maybe there's some weird scripting going on, but I don't know of anything in terms of core functionality other than C and C++. There is some C in Windows, as I said, down in the hardware abstraction layer, but it's really small. And it's like doing things like flipping CPU registers that only those instructions can handle that you can't do in C. As soon as you can do it in C, it's done in C. And it's not because they want to be bigger and fatter. It's just if you write good C, it's pretty much the same as assembly anyway, if you know what you're doing in that particular instruction set. And of course, you can't target any one instruction set when you're making it for 4, but I mean, let's face it, it's probably all Intel. What do you think about Windows? Oh, that's just where I was. Are you able to share the inside history and development of x86-64? How does its longevity with the ARM look? Or how does longevity look with ARM on the rise? So you probably know more about it than I do. I know we spent some time looking at IA64, which was the HP instruction set, as I remember it, which was partnered. I think it was HP and Intel got together and said, hey, we're going to come up with this kick-ass 64-bit instruction set. We're all going to support it. It'll be great. It took them forever. And when they were done, it wasn't that great. And we supported it for a while, but then AMD came along and said, well, what if we just like made all the instructions have 64 bits? You know, it wasn't that simple, but it was a pretty simple take on 64-bit architecture. They did that, and everybody just kind of ran with it and stuck with it, and we've long since forgot about IA64. I don't think it's even in the product anymore. The thing with ARM, and I take some personal pride in this, is that I did a ton of work to get NT and Windows itself to run on the MIPS and the Alpha and the PowerPC. The MIPS especially, that's what my dev machine was a MIPS. So if it didn't work on the MIPS, It didn't work in my office, and I had to fix it. And that's why things like Pinball and Task Manager work exceedingly well on a MIPS processor, because that's what I was using. So we had put all this work into it, and then they stopped shipping, and basically everything had contracted back to just Intel code only. And now, fortunately, with the ARM, it's going back to the case where ARM is not the same as MIPS, but I mean, they're both RISC instruction sets, and so there are a lot of similarities between them. And you can see this lineage, but more important, the code is ready for it, because we went through all the code line by line some 25 years ago to make sure that the code was ready for unaligned instructions and for requiring 64-bit alignment, for 64-bit instructions, for, well, Unicode text, lots of things that actually changed at the same time. But so it's very much ready for the ARM today. It's not optimized for the ARM today, but it's ready for the ARM today. And that's the last time. Well, I can't say it's not optimized, because what do I know? But had they just stuck with what we did 25 years ago, it would just be ready for the ARM. So presumably they've done extra work beyond that to optimize for the ARM. How's that? What was the toughest thing that you worked on while at Microsoft? Probably the toughest thing was, there was two toughest periods, technically. One was when I was an intern and they said, move the double space compression engine and a bunch of other stuff into the high memory area so that it's not under the 640K barrier. Basically, you'll get a little jump table. You'll only have 16 bytes or so, but out of the 640K, imagine the savings. And I was like, what? High memory what? I don't know any of this. I'm from 68,000 land. I work on an Amiga. I have no idea what you're talking about. Then I got, pretty nervous. I ran to the bookstore. The bookstore's like, I don't know, high memory area. Not in any of the indexes of any of the books. Even Andrew Schulman's books weren't available at that time. Or if they were, they didn't have them in the bookstore I was looking in, which I wish they had. So eventually I did find a magazine article in the corporate library that I found on an OS2 index server that, went to a box that had actual magazines. You took them out. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll check out this magazine. And the article in there had something on the HMA, which is the high memory area, which is, might as well tell you for the hell of it, on an IBM PC, there's something called, I believe it's the A10 line, something like that. We'll say A10 line. What it does is it controls the keyboard. But then they needed to overload it and say, oh, but it doesn't just control the keyboard. It also determines whether or not, when you get to the end of the address space on an Intel chip, you've got the segment and the address register, and they can both kind of be rewritten to express the same address in multiple different ways. What if you max them both? You'd be past the end of the address space. What does that even mean? Should it wrap around at the beginning, or should it shoot past into extended memory? Well, the A10 line controls which of those two cases happens. And so to move code into the above 640K barrier, what you did is you put a little jump table below 640K that all that code did was flip on the A10 line to make the code in extended memory visible, jump to it, do all its work, come back, hide it again with the A10 line so that everything ran normally and wrapped around address space as all MS-DOS stuff expected it to, and continued running. So basically, you could hide tons of code up above 640K, well, 384K of it, I guess, by doing this trick. But I had no idea what they're talking about or how to figure it out. So that was a scary period. The other one was when I was working on product activation, and we had a hack or an exploit, I guess you would call it, and a leaked key. I don't want to give away too much information. I don't want to get the details wrong, so I'm going to probably say less than I can about this. But let's say hypothetically there's a leaked key and you want to shut it down at the back end. Well, you can do some mathematical rigmarole in order to figure out, when anybody in the world submits their Windows key, did it come from this leaked key? And you can do that at the back end and shut them down so that even if they were able to activate Windows and get past the, kind of type it into the box and be accepted, when it goes up to the activation server says, no, that's all the key. So I'm sorry, it fails. Well, that's a simplified case, but it required a lot of math in order to find out whether or not the key in question was shared with the leaked range of keys, basically. And spent a lot of time trying to understand mathematicians, because we had actual real live mathematicians on staff that understood, Ramanujan numbers and linear elliptical curve cryptography. I mean, I can tell you what the Wikipedia article says, but I can't write, elliptical curve math, that's for sure. So we had the guys that could actually do that kind of stuff, do it for us, and then say, this is how it works. And we'd go write code that did that. But when it came to figuring out how to counter an exploit, you kind of had to get them involved. So it was a lot of working directly with mathematicians and stuff that was kind of over my head, but fortunately, they were fun to work with. So what are your core thoughts on WSL? For me, it's one of the best things in the last 15 years. Yeah, me too, actually. For me, it's one of the things that got me back using the PC for recreational stuff on a daily basis. I don't mean gaming. I mean just doing my daily PC stuff I do on a PC rather than on the shell of the Mac, because WSL2 gives me all the tools that I would want on a Linux machine right inside of Windows. And people think, oh, yeah, it's got to be so slow, but it's really not. WSL2, it's hypervisor. So what happens is the CPU is basically split up and multiple operating systems get a chance to be the exclusive operating system. So Windows runs bare metal on the hardware for a while, and then it switches over to the Linux schedule and gives it the CPU and says, you run for a while, and it runs bare metal on the hardware for a while, and it gives it to the next one in the hypervisor. Your VM, down the line, runs bare metal on the hardware for a while. That's a bit of a gross oversimplification, but short of certain instructions and certain things, it's not going through a simulation layer or an abstraction layer. It's actually just running on the hardware in such a way that allows it to get pretty much native performance. Now, it's not quite. I believe on CPU-Z, I get 510 if I'm in a hypervisor installation. I get 520 if I'm not. So that's what, 1 part in 50, which is just under 2%. So yeah, and I've heard that number, under 2% for hypervisor. So by doing that, though, you virtualize your CPU in such a way that you can run multiple operating systems side by side at the same time, and that's the cool part. So that's why I love WSL, because you're actually running Ubuntu or whatever version of Linux you choose, bare metal on the hardware in a time slice or a time shared version on your CPU, not in a, let's put Linux under Windows, it has to go through Windows to do file operations and all that nonsense, which was true in WSL1, is no longer true in WSL2. It's a completely different architecture. So it's like Proxmox or any of those. So if you've not checked it out, it's dead simple to use and really easy to install. So if you're a Linux fan and you've got a Windows box, it's the way to run Linux, I think. What else we got here? Did you know Dave Keller personally? No, I mean, I knew him to say hello in the hallway type thing, but no, I didn't like hang out with a dude or anything. I know he drove a purple Porsche and see him in the parking lot, talk to him in the lunchroom, that kind of thing. But beyond that, no. How many people, developers, actually design Windows? Handful, hundreds, thousands? Well, design, it depends on what level of contribution to design you're talking about. I would say that normally what happens is there's a design team, which will be program managers and UI designers and people like that will get together and decide, what do we need to add to Windows to make it more compelling? So they'll come up with features they want to add, and they'll do mock-ups and simulations, or what the heck do we used to use? Not Flash. It was something like Flash, but it wasn't Flash. People would make mock-ups of UI and kind of show you what they wanted it to do, and then you would be tasked with, now go make this real. And behind the scenes, it will say, and now the disk is partitioned. Now you've got to write actual disk partitioning code. So it's often pretty complicated. I don't mean like just take their code and stick some like UI on top of it. What the programmer contributes generally are all of the unspoken, or at least what I did was fill in all of the unspoken rough edges that aren't defined yet. You would think a good programmer should go back to the program manager, the PM, the designer, and say, hey, you were ambiguous in these areas. I don't know what you wanted, so please tell me. I just decided what I wanted in those areas. At least that was the general way I ever operated. And some PMs like that, and some PMs did not like that. So, and sometimes I chose right, and sometimes I chose poorly. So it really depends on how well I chose. And I'm not a PM, and I'm not a UI designer, but I don't know if I should say I aspired to be one, but I certainly acted like one at times when there wasn't anyone else around. So Who were the designers for Windows XP? Primarily, I guess it would be Joe Belfiore and his team. There were certainly way more people involved, but I'm trying to think who has ultimate look and feel approval for the product. And he said it for Windows 95. So I would presume that by XP, since the look was pretty much unified, it's safe to say that Joe had it for XP as well. And I'm going to find out as soon as I'm done this that, oh my God, why did you say it was actually Steve Wojcicki? Sorry, Steve. And I made that name up. So Steve won't be really mad, but somebody might. Do you have something that you really hate about Windows and could never change or modify for it to be better for one reason or another? I can't think of anything that drove me crazy. I mean, there were technical things that I wanted not to be true that were limitations, but here's a really stupid but simple example. In the MS-DOS world, there was a program from Norton in Norton Utilities called NCD. And what it would do is once a day, or however often you ran this little demon, it would build a database of every file and directory on your PC. And then you could type like NCD source. And no matter where source was in your giant disk, it knew where the source folder was. And you could, or not even alt tab, just tab through all the source folders. So you could type CD source WAM or NCD. And it was so much easier than having to know that you had to go to, /users/source/whatever folder system you have going on. So it was a great utility, but the problem on Windows NT was that you could not change the current directory of the parent process unless there was a really weird case in there that was actually probably to support Norton CD for all I know, but that was integration with the NTVDM, which was the 16-bit interpreter. So the 16-bit code could change the parent process through some weird hook, but 32-bit apps could not. So there was no way for a command line utility to change the parent utility, which was CMD. Something run by CMD can't change CMD's parent directory. So I always wished it could. And I actually checked out CMD and I built it. And then I looked at things like the for and the set command, and it terrified me. And I realized if I make any change to CMD whatsoever, it's going to break so many things that I just don't want to be responsible for that. So I just ran away and didn't touch CMD, but it's something I would have liked to have added. What are your thoughts on people getting Task Manager to play videos? I want to know how they're doing it, because if they're actually loading the CPU, and I believe, what's the guy for Sysinternals, Mark Russinovich, I believe he did this, and he did it correctly. He did it as I speculated in my one video about how I would do it, and then he did it very similarly, which is to basically occupy one CPU's core for the amount of time that you want to shade in that cell. And with task affinity or thread affinity, you lock that little task to that particular core. And so you can vary the color of the box in Task Manager by varying the load on that core, by varying the load on that task in that thread that you've assigned to be on that core. And he does much the same thing. And that's cool, but are they really on a 128 core machine creating 128 threads and loading them all appropriately? I don't actually know. If they are, that is cool. If that's how they're doing it, I'm impressed, and that's cool. If they're hacking Task Manager and just sending it window messages that cause it to paint that way, that's somewhat impressive in its own right, but it's not as cool as knowing that the actual machine is doing the work of simulating the entire workload that maps to the Task Manager display in such a way that, and if it's not clear what we're talking about because I didn't explain that, so I probably should have started with that. What it is on Task Manager, imagine you have lots of cores. So you actually have like graph paper of actual CPUs. So you have something like 8 by 8, let's say, 64 cores. Well, you can draw a little Pac-Man on there, right? We're doing its thing on this basic graph by changing the CPU usage of all those CPUs to map to a picture, and doing it over and over and changing it per frame, 20 times a second. It's not a good use of time, but it's cool. Which historic OS would you like to see make a return, Dave? I was going to say, the PDP-11, but I guess that's already come back. Probably, well, there's two. VMS is cool because it's so stable, but it's really verbose on the command line, and that always bugged me. There was another is it RSTX or RSTS or RTS-TSX? One of the original PDP-11 operating systems that was not Unix, but was also, I think, made by Dave C. when he was like a child back at AT&T or where he worked, DEC, I guess. You could map function keys to sessions. So you press F1 and you'd have a new console, and you press F2 and you have a new console, and press F3 and you have a new console, and you could do things in your F3 console. And F1 and the screen would clear and you'd be in your F1 console. So you could have all these sessions open, which now is the same as having just a bunch of windows open. But in the 1970s, that was pretty cool. So being able to have multiple sessions running on anything and being able to like cycle through them very quickly with a keyboard was really handy. I mean, you can sort of do it in Unix, pushing tasks into the background and popping things into the foreground and creating jobs and that kind of work, but it wasn't as simple as F1, F2, F3, F4. Why, oh, so many whys. Why did Windows 95 opt to cover the DOS prompt with the safe to turn off bitmap on shutdown? Because it would look silly if they left the DOS prompt up and said it was safe to shut down. I don't know. Let's see. Why did you leave Microsoft? Because I actually wound up writing a bunch of shareware utilities before Microsoft and then continuing to do so while I was at Microsoft. And I had a couple that took off really well and were making enough money that it didn't make any sense for me to stay at Microsoft. And by that, I mean, temporarily at least, they were making large amounts of money that made it very painful for me to stay at Microsoft because I was like neglecting a very large opportunity. So I loved Microsoft, and I had to decide what it is I'm going to do. And basically, it came down to I can't do both well. I'm going to screw this up. I've got this huge opportunity, and I'm either going to bone it up or I'm going to screw up my day job. So I decided I'm going to leave and just take the good opportunity. And worst case, maybe they'll take me back. And it did well enough that I never wound up going back. So in my case, I did not leave until I was like super certain that I had a good gig going on. I did not take any big flying leaps of faith or imagination. I waited until it was stupid not to leave. So, what's the oldest and crustiest piece of code in Windows? Edlin. I believe Edlin is still in there. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure if you go into a Windows command box, and somebody can try this and tell us in the comments, but I believe Edlin is still available on a Windows system somewhere, and it actually goes back to MS-DOS 2, I believe. It's a line editor, as the name implies, not even a screen editor. So you tell it what line of the file you want to edit, like L3 is now this line, and it's pretty horrible, but it works. And it is ancient. What kind of programs did you write for your Commodore 64? Well, the first one I wrote was, well, not the first one I wrote. The only one I wrote that was commercial was a game called Tour de Force, which was a cycling game, a side scroller with obstacles, and you had your bike, and there were other cycles on the course. And then there was 3D parallax scrolling of a couple layers in the background that actually looked pretty cool. And unfortunately, the company I wrote it for went out of business like shortly after I finished the game and before the game actually got released. It was being done by Gremlin Graphics over in the UK. And they did release the Amstrad version, which was based on my version. But my version never got released. So I worked on one game and it never got released. But I finished it, so it counts. And you can actually go and see the cover art and stuff. There's gamesthatweren't.com, I think, is the place. What else? Commodore 64. So I wrote the stuff that everybody writes, right? I wrote like adventure games, and I wrote backgammon, or not backgammon, blackjack, and I wrote a Hammurabi type game where you did resource management. I did this for a BBS, and it was funny because, well, first of all, I had a friend, Chris, who wrote BBS software and KBBS, and it was great software. So I decided I want to run a BBS, but I have a phone and I don't have an auto answer modem. So I'll just, when the phone rings, I'll just flip the switch. I don't know what I was thinking. So anyway, I did that for a while, and I think I then got an auto answer modem. Yes, I did. I finally did, and I let it run for a while. But this was also my phone line as a kid, so I mean, the phone would ring all the time. It was rather annoying. Anyway, I continued to run this BBS for a while, and I wrote this Hammurabi resource management game where you would say, I want, I'm going to have this many soldiers and this many farmers. And I'm going to buy this much grain. And I'm going to buy this many swords. And it was one of those kind of games. And then you would do a turn. and all the other players would do their turn, and everybody would then compete. And you would have to log in. People would log in at different times. But somebody obviously exploited a bug because they would be monstrously powerful and have billions of coins by the time I would always, check in the next morning, and they would have decimated and destroyed everybody and have billions of coins. Like the most egregious bug like that. And I don't know what my bug ever was. I never found my bug. But one bug I saw like that was in the TRS-80 blackjack game, where you could bet negative amounts and then intentionally lose. You'd think they would have caught that one. Why was Space Cadet installed with an INF file? I found it the other day in C Windows INF, purely to annoy you. Did it work on Microsoft Kids? No, I never did. Fine Artist and Creative Writer, those were cool things. McZ, yeah, I don't know anything about. They were kind of their own little enclave that I never interacted with, because they were off in Microsoft Studios, which was actually a different physical location, still in Redmond, but they were in their own building, in their own area, so we didn't bump into the halls in them. If you could rewrite Windows, what would you change about the design with things like the kernel, or just in general? I don't think I would change the kernel. I'm pretty happy with the way it works, especially the way it supports multiple subsystems and things running simultaneously. I think is pretty cool now. But what would I change? The registry hurts me a little bit to say it, but the registry makes some sense. But then when you're trying to move a user state from one place to another place, it can be a huge mess to try and take the registry with you. And they do a great job of it now. And they also virtualize the registry so that when you are writing to the registry, you get your own private little view of the registry. And if you corrupt it, well, you're just corrupting your Tony.exe version of the registry and not the system global one. So they've been a lot smarter about things like that. One of the programs that I wrote, or I'd actually write it, I was selling because I licensed from somebody else, was a Registry Cleaner. And what it did was it went through all the registry and it looked for things that pointed to files that didn't exist, for example. So if you said, this is my font, but I don't have this font, well, we can remove that entry and things will actually be a little faster next boot because it won't go looking for this font file that you don't have. And you can do it with DLLs, and you can do it with various other things, and you can build a tree and eventually prune the registry back quite substantially, especially on a machine that's had a bunch of stuff installed and uninstalled and installed and uninstalled. The registry gets to be really messy, and it's very hard to know what it's okay to remove. And so the system doesn't remove anything that is not explicitly removed by the uninstall. So if the uninstall doesn't clean it up, it's there forever. And that's why you build up this baggage in a system that over time doesn't have to be, but if it's not removed, tends to slow things down and create bloat in the registry. So the program that I licensed from SysTweak was called Registry Cleaner, and eventually Advanced Registry Optimizer, I believe. And it would go through and do this house clipping on it. And the best case I ever saw was, I think, on my mom's machine. I went to visit her, and her poor machine was just crippled because, grandma's like, well, they install all the Facebook games and they install pretty much everything. And she was new to computers at the time, so it was just getting used to everything. And we just click on yes to everything. And eventually had all kinds of crappy malware and stuff that had installed all kinds of just nonsense on her machine that had largely been removed. But then all the stuff in the registry had been there. And when I ran it, it found something like 50,000 entries in the registry that I went through and cleaned up. And the machine was substantially different after. And so that's before I licensed it. From Shishale, and then I realized it's actually a pretty useful utility. So it was something I was happy to actually have. I don't mean there's anything intrinsically wrong with the registry, because you could have this on a Linux system too if you installed thousands of apps that wrote little INF, or not INF files, wrote config files and then didn't clean them up intentionally when they went away. So if you did a sudo apt install and it didn't force clean up files that got left behind, and you just kept installing and uninstalling packages until your machine was full of crap, well, yeah, you're going to expect some bad performance. And that can happen under Windows 2. It could happen under Linux, but you rarely ever put a machine in that situation. So if you could have remained in Saskatchewan to work for Microsoft, would you have stayed, and why? No, because I wanted to work with the people, unless there was like a whole real big entourage of people from Redmond that were working in Regina, which is where I was living. I wanted to be in Redmond with the people that were working on MS-DOS and the mainstream projects, not just working at a company that was owned by Microsoft. I was already working at a company that was owned by IBM, so it was not a big difference whether it was owned by Microsoft or owned by IBM if you were off at a branch office, probably. So, no, I wanted to be there. Did you ever get paid by lines of code? I always thought it was dumb. No, I never got paid by lines of code. No, I guess there's an implicit, if you are working somewhere for a long time and you never check in any new code, they're going to say, Dave, you checked in 8 lines of code last year and that kind of thing. But no, you never get paid by lines of code. The only person I ever heard talk about KLOX was not Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer. And I don't remember if he was being serious or if he was actually mocking IBM and their love of keeping track of KLOX, which is the thousands lines of code. So how many KLOX are in that project? Oh, that thing's 200 KLOX. I don't know. It was a big deal to them. So it was like how big a project was and how many people worked on it and how many parking spots you got in the company parking lot, all those things. How much math was involved in NT development? Well, if you worked on OpenGL, there'd be a fair bit of math. If you worked on things that use math, there'd be a lot of math. But for me, there was just pure old integer math. I don't think I ever touched a floating point variable in the shell that I can remember. Until we got to the product activation and protection, which used a bunch of cryptography, which is pretty advanced math that was really over my head, but that I was kind of like, I grasped enough of to be dangerous, but I couldn't have come up with it from first principles, but it was enough that it was cool to be exposed to. Because I did have combinatorial and, some math in college, but not graduate level crazy math that they were using. Did you write assembly for Microsoft if each machine has different assembly code? Are there different flavors of assembly that processor assemblers can use? I'm not quite sure what that means, but at Microsoft, the only times we generally ever wrote an assembly were things like MS-DOS, where it was all the machines ran the same version. You didn't want to have to have 5 processors you were supporting, or how many we had? We had Intel, Alpha, MIPS, PowerPC, so 4 at least. So you didn't want to have to write something in assembly and then write it 4 times. You wanted to write it once well in C. And people often argue that, well, assembly is faster, but there's so few cases where it really matters that the CPU is actually fully CPU bound. Probably what's more important is overall code size. And I have found that unless you've got, Steve Gibson or some other assembly language genius really taking their time to hand optimize a piece of assembly code down in terms of size, people are good at making it fast, but not always great at making it small, whereas compilers are pretty good at making it small and not always great at making it fast, if that makes any sense. So compilers, if you do a /O size on CLang, it's pretty impressive what it does in terms of register allocation and stuff for making your code tiny. How did the signature of XC become MZ? Was it because of Mark Zafesky? No, but that might be an attempt at spelling Mark Zibikowski. And it was because of Mark Zibikowski, as far as I know. He goes back in MS-DOS forever and then was there all the way through my time there too. So he was basically in charge of the file signature for the loader for everything. So it's MZ. Going through here. So I'm going to say we got about 10 more minutes. Going through the question list here to make sure I haven't missed any juicy ones here. Do I have a picture with Bill? No, I do not. I never was like, hey, let's take a picture. That'd be kind of weird, I think. Sign this. Yeah, I remember that one. Actually, Dave C. had a race car and people were coming up to him with posters of his race car and getting to sign it. And I thought that was really strange. But then I'm not wired in such a way that I am really interested in famous people. So that's a long story. But what is your opinion of the VMM32 VXD file? I don't even know what that is, man. It's like some Win95 file. I've never seen a VXD. That's like a device driver on Windows 95. Is it true that stock options in the 90s at Microsoft for employees were very lucrative? They could be, but probably not for guys coming out of college. I bet if you got hired out of industry, and let's say you came in and had 10,000 options, And I didn't have 10,000 options, but let's say you had 10,000 options because you came in from industry, as I said. Then what happened was, in the time I was there, I think the stock split 3 times at least, or maybe 4 times. So your 10,000 became 20,000, then 40,000, then 80,000, then 160,000. So now you've got 160,000 shares of Microsoft stock. You've got options on them. So every time the stock moves $1, in theory, on paper, if you're lucky, and that holds true for a long time, then you've made $160,000. And that's the drug. That's why people are at their keyboards hitting F5 all day long to see what the stock price is doing. But it goes up and goes down. And so, yeah, some people in the night, Microsoft generated something like 10 to 11, 12,000 millionaires just from its IPO. So there was a lot of money came out of there. But by the time the 90s came around, there were years of stagnation where if you got hired where I did, or you got hired 2 to 3 years before me, the stock was flat for years in between there. So it didn't really matter. And similarly, if you got hired sufficiently far after me, it had already run up enough that there wasn't a lot of growth left. And then I had a bunch of stock in the Y2K, of course, not stock, I should say options on stock, that when Y2K, and it wasn't the Y2K computer bug, it was the Justice Department and a bunch of other stuff combined at the same time, kind of hit the stock really hard. And so it contracted a lot. But fortunately, along the way, I had been forced to sell, because when you're granted an option, it's granted for 10 years at most. And then pretty soon they were granted only for 7 years. So you were forced to sell them. You could convert them to stock if you could pony up the money to actually pay the taxes on the difference, or on the growth. But I only know a couple people that did that, and they were clever to have done so. But have you checked out NT WinFile since Microsoft made it open? No, I have not. I didn't know WinFile was open source. That's awesome. I'm gonna have to go check that out. That was my big idea. So when you go to a Bill Gates intern party, you generally, I assume, have an idea in the back of your head that if you get stuck in a conversation with Bill and he's like, "So what are you working on?" You'll have something interesting to say. You don't want to be like, "I don't know." So mine was, my suggestion was that we should add FTP support to File Manager, WinFile, because, I was coming from college and I was big on the internet. And what do you do with the internet? Well, you use FTP, you use Gopher, you use Archie. That's what the internet's about. So that's what I saw of the internet. So I thought of the Windows product in terms of file transfer and decided that we should add internet support to File Manager, and so on. I had many ideas on how we should do so. And they probably would have all been good ideas, but not great ideas. So a good thing that they came up with the web browser as an alternative. Let's see. I'm starting an internship with Microsoft on Monday. Do you have any advice to be successful? Man, it's such a different company now than when I worked there. I'd be like, yeah, you should live there, get a little cot and get under your desk, and maybe like a scrub brush to get under there when you've been there too long, but that's not the way to go about it now. So I would say that for Microsoft today, you should honestly, I would say, talk to people that are there today to find out what it is the company and the current culture values the most, and then try to deliver that. And I know that sounds stupid and cliche, but if the thing that they all value is impact across products and accessibility, and you're saying, I'm cranking code down to the last cycle, nobody's going to care, because you didn't cross product boundaries and you didn't increase accessibility. So that's what I mean, when you got to know what they want. So find out what it is that tickles their fancy today and try to deliver that. Do you like garlic bread? I do. I'm not a big fan of bread that's been cooked like that unless it's got garlic on it. So I'm okay with bread that's raw with butter, and I like toast with garlic, but not just toast. Do you write code to use Hungarian notation? I use sort of a weird bastardized camel case with a little bit of Hungarian in front. So let's say I have a string and it is to the bathroom password. It'll be SZ bathroom password, and everything will be uppercase after the SZ. So I'm using some Hungarian notation to denote what the variable is, in this case, a null terminated string, and not a lot. So yeah, I've kind of stepped out of most of it. Do you use each other's usernames when talking in the office? Yes. I was Davepl, and my boss was Mark TA, and my friend was John B.E., and that's actually how you referred to people. And Bob Day was a special case because that was his name, as was Eric Flo, also his name. Very short email aliases, Bob Day and Eric Flo, because their whole names fit in their aliases. Whereas for the rest of us, they were truncated, and that's what we wanted to call each other. So yeah, we actually did. All right, I'm gonna digest what's left of the list as soon as I can and use it to produce probably the next Q&A video, and I'll go into it and try and do a live stream at a better time of day for the European crowd and answer some of the questions that I wasn't able to answer tonight. So I'm gonna fumble for the how do you close this thing button in a minute, but until then, thanks a lot for joining me, and in the meantime and in between time, thanks for joining me out here in the shop tonight. Talk to you next time. Now, how do you close this thing?